All right, guys, so today we're going to discuss chapter 12, which is the endocrine system. It's not a really long chapter, and this isn't really going to be a long lecture, but there is going to be a ton of memorization with this chapter. So you really are going to have to know all the different hormones, where they come from, where they go to, and what they do. So it's just going to be a ton of memorization. So we're going to talk about the endocrine system in general before we get into all those different hormones. Just so you know, endocrinology is the study of the endocrine system, and an endocrinologist is a doctor or provider who specializes in the endocrine system. So here's a picture of all the different glands that are part of the endocrine system. All of these glands secrete chemicals, also known as hormones, that influence almost every cell and organ in the body. So we'll talk about most of these glands here, and then when we get to that specific system, we'll talk about them again. Like we've already briefly talked about the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland when we talked about the nervous system. When we talk about the GI system, we'll talk about the pancreas, and so on and so forth. So just a reminder that endocrine glands are ductless glands. They secrete their hormones directly into the bloodstream. So those are a bit different than things like our sweat glands. And then those hormones go in the blood to the target cells. The cells of many different organs are exposed to these particular hormones. However, only cells having receptors for that specific hormone, called target cells, will respond. So even though so many different cells in our body will be exposed to these hormones, there's only specialized cells that are going to respond. So the endocrine system and the nervous system are actually very similar, yet very different. So let's talk about some of the differences and some of the similarities by using this chart. If you look in your book on page 222, it also gives you some picture diagrams and really spells this out at the bottom of the page. So you'll definitely want to go there and look, or you can follow along there now. So the endocrine system uses hormones. The nervous system uses neurotransmitters. So we already learned about those. The endocrine system distributes hormones via the bloodstream. The neurotransmitters are secreted into a synapse to make that stimuli continue. The endocrine system responds much more slowly than the nervous system. We just learned about the nervous system and how quickly those stimuli move. The endocrine system, however, is going to have longer lasting effects, and it's going to adapt slowly to continual stimulation versus the nervous system, which is going to adapt very quickly. Both of these systems work together to ensure that the body maintains homeostasis. This is just a picture here kind of showing you the hormones, and there's two different types of hormones. So there's either steroid hormones or non-steroid hormones. Steroid hormones are synthesized from cholesterol, and non-steroid hormones are protein-based and are synthesized from amino acids, which are the building blocks for proteins. So once a hormone reaches its target cell, which is what it's showing you here, and it shows you the difference between what happens, it binds with a receptor to trigger changes within the cell. Steroid hormones pass easily through a cell's membrane. Once inside the cell, they bind to receptors in the nucleus, and that's how they have their effect. However, non-steroid hormones in that bottom cell there can't penetrate the cell wall, and they bind to receptors on the cell surface. The binding activates a second messenger system. So that's one of the main differences. Steroid hormones don't need a secondary messenger system, and non-steroid hormones do. The second messenger system makes this cascade of processes that ultimately results in the production of a second messenger that activates specific enzymes and influences cellular reactions, producing the cell's response to the hormone. So much more of an involved process here with the non-steroid hormones. So let's talk through the glands and the hormones that are going to come from each gland. So in the brain, we have the pituitary and the hypothalamus. So here's the hypothalamus, and here's the pituitary. The pituitary gland influences more body processes than any other endocrine gland. So it's going to be really, really important. The pea-sized pituitary gland sits just underneath the hypothalamus, and these are really going to work together to make this pituitary hypothalamus kind of system. the pituitary gland is two different glands, actually. It's an anterior pituitary and a posterior pituitary. So we're going to talk about those separately so you can get an idea of what's happening there. This is like the connection, and it's showing you how really the hormones come from the hypothalamus down to the pituitary. The anterior pituitary is the larger of the two pituitary glands. It consists of a glandular tissue and secretes a number of important hormones under the direction of the hypothalamus. So neurons within the hypothalamus synthesize releasing hormones, which stimulate the anterior pituitary to secrete its hormones. So the hypothalamus has to secrete a hormone to tell the anterior pituitary to secrete its hormones. It also secretes an inhibiting hormone, which tells the anterior pituitary to kind of stop producing the hormone. So the neurons of the hypothalamus release their hormones into a system of blood vessels called the hypophyseal portal system here, which you can see in this diagram. The blood travels straight to the anterior pituitary. So it goes directly to the anterior pituitary and causes them to release certain hormones or to suppress certain hormones. So first, we need to talk about the hormones that are released by the hypothalamus. So these are all the different ones. Each hormone acts on the anterior pituitary to release or suppress a particular hormone. For thyrotropin releasing hormone stimulates the anterior pituitary to release thyrotropin, also called thyroid stimulating hormone. So we have to have a hormone, remember, from the hypothalamus to tell the anterior pituitary. So this is where this chapter gets a little confusing because we have to remember which ones are going from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, and then the anterior pituitary is going to secrete more hormones that are going to affect the rest of the body. So you can see here that we have gonadotropin releasing hormone. And what might help you distinguish these, especially in a testing environment, is if you see releasing or inhibiting hormone, then more than likely you know they're coming from the hypothalamus. Okay, so you can work your way through these. We're going to talk about each of the hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary in a bit more detail. So here's all of the, hold on, let me get this box out of our way. Come on, there we go. So we can see here all of the different hormones of the anterior pituitary. So we have thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, also known as thyrotropin, stimulates the thyroid gland to secrete thyroid hormones. We have prolactin, which stimulates milk production in the mammary glands in females. And in males, it makes the testes more sensitive to luteinizing hormone. We have the adrenocorticopic hormone, ACTH. It stimulates the adrenal cortex to secrete corticosteroids. So you can see how many steps this really takes, right? The hypothalamus tells the anterior pituitary to secrete a hormone. That hormone goes someplace else and ultimately tells that place to do something else. So there's multiple steps really in the endocrine system. So we have growth hormone that acts on the entire body to promote protein synthesis, lipid and carbohydrate metabolism, and bone and skeletal muscle growth. We have luteinizing hormone, which is a gonadotropin. It stimulates ovulation and estrogen and progesterone synthesis in females, and the secretion of testosterone by the testes in males. Then we have follicle-stimulating hormone, which is also a gonadotropin, and it stimulates the production of eggs in the ovaries of females and sperm in the testes of males. So the follicles really are the pieces that we need for reproduction to occur. Then we have the posterior pituitary. So you can see here it's, again, that direct connection between the hypothalamus. A few less hormones here. The differences between the anterior and the posterior pituitary is that the posterior pituitary is actually made of neural tissue. If you remember, the anterior pituitary is made of glandular tissue. So instead of synthesizing hormones, the posterior pituitary stores the hormones, antidiuretic hormone, ADH, and oxytocin, which are synthesized by the hypothalamus. Oxytocin stimulates contraction of the uterus during childbirth and triggers the release of milk from breast. And then ADH antidiuretic hormone, or vasopressin, acts on the kidneys to reduce urine volume and prevent dehydration. So it makes our body kind of hold on to water. If you look on page 226, there's a really big chart there. And this is like the chunk of information that you really need to know. So you really need to put that information to memory and really know those hormones. Where are they coming from? Where are they going? And what are they going to have an effect on? So let's watch an animation.
The tiny, pea-sized pituitary gland sits just underneath the hypothalamus. Despite its small size, the pituitary gland is actually two distinct glands. The anterior pituitary, the larger of the two pituitary glands, consists of glandular tissue. The posterior pituitary is made of neural tissue. The anterior pituitary synthesizes and secretes a number of very important hormones under the direction of the hypothalamus. The process begins when neurons within the hypothalamus synthesize various hormones. The neurons release their hormones into a system of blood vessels called the hypophyseal portal system. The hypophyseal portal system carries the hormones from the hypothalamus to target cells in the anterior pituitary. Some of these hormones, called releasing hormones, stimulate the anterior pituitary to release specific hormones into general circulation. Other hypothalamic hormones, called inhibiting hormones, cause the anterior pituitary to suppress the release of certain hormones. In contrast with the anterior pituitary, which is composed of glandular tissue, the posterior pituitary is made of nerve fibers that originate in the hypothalamus. Instead of synthesizing hormones as the anterior pituitary does, the posterior pituitary simply stores hormones synthesized by the hypothalamus. Specifically, the hypothalamic neurons synthesize hormones which they send down to the posterior pituitary to be stored. The posterior pituitary holds the hormones until stimulated by the nervous system to release them.
So just a little summary of what we just talked about. I want to talk a little bit about the control of pituitary secretions. Now, we talked before about negative feedback systems, and we're going to talk in a little bit more detail about that here. So there's two different ways that they control the pituitary secretions. One is by the central nervous system, so the brain monitors the condition and it triggers the hormone release as needed. Secretion of pituitary hormones don't occur kind of in the steady stream. They're in like phases or pulses. The second way that pituitary secretions are monitored is by negative feedback. So the pituitary stimulates glands to release hormones. The hormone is fed back to the pituitary, which halts release of the hormone. So it's kind of like this circle that we talked about before, like your furnace in your house, right? So your furnace is set to a certain temperature. Heat kicks on when that drops below. Once it drops above, when we have enough heat, it shuts back off. So the system is going to work very similar to that. So here is an example of that. We're going to watch a quick animation on that as well.
When the pituitary gland stimulates another endocrine gland to secrete its hormone, that hormone is then fed back to the pituitary, telling it to stop further release of the tropic hormone. This process is called negative feedback. Negative feedback loops are used extensively to regulate hormones in the hypothalamic pituitary axis. The regulation of body temperature illustrates the negative feedback process. When body temperature decreases, the hypothalamus is stimulated to release thyrotropin-releasing hormone, or TRH. In turn, TRH stimulates the anterior pituitary to release thyroid-stimulating hormone, or TSH. TSH stimulates the thyroid to release thyroid hormones. Thyroid hormones stimulate metabolism, increasing warmth. At the same time, the increased thyroid hormone inhibits release of TSH by the pituitary. This is an example of negative feedback.
So just like what we talked about when we talked about the furnace, right? This is just an example of the hormones and how the hormones are controlled by negative feedback in our body. So the next gland I want to talk about is the pineal gland. You can see here on the diagram, it's also located in the brain. It's really on the roof of the brain's third ventricle. And the job of the pineal gland is to produce melatonin. It's a hormone that rises at night when sunlight is absent and falls during the day. High melatonin levels trigger sleepiness, making it a factor in the sleep-wake cycle. You'll notice that you can buy melatonin actually over the counter. And people actually take it as a supplement if they have difficulty falling asleep. So the hormone will trigger sleepiness. So you'll see sometimes people taking this. It's a pretty safe supplement to take. The thymus is the next gland. It lies in the mediastinum, just near the sternum. So you can see that here in the middle of the chest. In children, the thymus gland is very large. It begins to shrink in puberty, and by old age, it consists mostly of fat and fibrous tissues. The thymus secretes thymosin and thymopoietin. And if you look in your book, you'll be able to look at the spellings of that, page 228. These hormones have a role in the development of the immune system. Because it secretes hormones, the thymus is a member of the endocrine system, but the actions of the hormones actually make the thymus part of the immune system. So we'll talk more about it in more detail when we talk about the immune system, but you just need to know the hormones that it secretes and that they play a role in the development of the immune system, which is why it's very large in children. Next is the thyroid gland. So the thyroid is the largest endocrine gland. It consists of two large lobes connected by a narrow band of tissue called the isthmus. The thyroid gland resides in the neck. It wraps around the anterior and lateral portions of the trachea. So you actually, when your doctors are palpating in your neck, often they're trying to see if your thyroid gland is enlarged. These are what the cells look like in the thyroid gland. It's made up of these tiny sacs called thyroid follicles. Each follicle is filled with a thick fluid called thyroid colloid. The cells lining the sacs secrete the two main thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. And unlike other glands, the thyroid gland can store hormones for later use. So that's a differentiating factor when it comes to the thyroid gland. Cells between the thyroid follicles, parafollicle cells, secrete the hormone calcitonin in response to increasing blood calcium levels. So calcitonin triggers the deposition of calcium in bones and thus promotes bone formation. So three hormones really are being secreted here, T3 and T4. Okay. So TSH comes from the anterior pituitary to the thyroid, tells the thyroid to secrete T3 and T4. Also in here, the thyroid tissue is calcitonin, which helps to decrease blood calcium levels by depositing calcium in bone. Also, the parathyroid glands, they're actually on the posterior surface of the thyroid. They secrete parathyroid hormone in response to low blood levels of calcium. So the opposite of what calcitonin does, parathyroid hormone does. Most people have 4 parathyroid glands, but sometimes the location and numbers can vary. Parathyroid hormone is the main hormone used to maintain normal blood levels of calcium. Like I said, though, it does work in conjunction with calcitonin. What parathyroid hormone does is inhibits new bone formation and stimulates the breakdown of old bones, causing calcium and phosphate to move out of the bone and into the blood. So if blood calcium levels are low, parathyroid hormone is stimulated. It helps to break down bone and increase calcium in the blood. Parathyroid hormone also encourages the kidneys to reabsorb calcium so that we're not voiding it out in our urine. It also prompts the kidneys to activate vitamin D, which is important for intestinal absorption of calcium. About 99% of our body's calcium is found in our bones. So these two hormones are going to play a big role in either depositing calcium into the bones or breaking down bone so that we can get more calcium into the blood. So let's talk about how this regulation of blood calcium levels really works. We just kind of did, right? Talked about the differences. So that if we have an increase in blood calcium, thyroid releases calcitonin, calcium moves from blood to bone, and blood calcium levels decrease, right? On the other hand, if we don't have enough blood or calcium in the blood, parathyroid hormone releases PTH, calcium moves from the bones, kidneys, and intestines to the blood and increases the amount of calcium in the blood. So let's watch the animation on that quick. Come on.
Parathyroid hormone is the main hormone the body uses to maintain normal levels of calcium in the blood. Calcitonin, which is secreted by the thyroid gland, has an antagonistic effect on the parathyroid hormone. The interaction of these two hormones helps the body achieve calcium homeostasis. If blood calcium levels rise too high, the thyroid gland releases calcitonin. Calcitonin causes calcium to move from the blood to bone. This causes blood calcium levels to decrease and blood calcium levels to normalize. If blood calcium levels drop below normal, the parathyroid glands release parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone causes calcium to move from the bones, the kidneys, and the intestines to the blood until blood calcium levels become normal.
So just a reiteration of what I just said there. The next gland is the adrenal glands. So the adrenal glands actually is two different glands. We have the inner portion, which is called the adrenal medulla, consists of modified neurons and functions as part of the sympathetic nervous system. And we have the outer portion, the adrenal cortex, which is actually glandular tissue and secretes steroid hormones or corticosteroids. And the adrenal glands you can see here are located on the top of each kidney. So we do have two of these situated on the top of each kidney. So the adrenal medulla contains modified neurons that act as part of the sympathetic nervous system. These cells secrete catecholamines, epinephrine, and norepinephrine in response to stimulation. So if you think back to what the sympathetic nervous system does, remember our fight or flight system, these hormones play a direct role in activating that system. So think back to what that system did, right? Increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, decreased our GI stimulation, and get ready, for that, to be able to respond, to that bear chasing you or whatever situation is happening. Down below there, you can see that it has, multiple layers. Each layer secretes a different, you can see here, right? So we get the outer layers, okay? So, and then we have the adrenal medulla kind of is stopping there. We actually have multiple layers. So let me just clarify that again, because I know this is somewhat confusing. This is actually showing you part of the adrenal medulla and of the adrenal cortex, okay? So the outer edge here is the medulla, okay? Or the cortex, and then the medulla. So in the cortex here, we actually have three different layers of tissue. Each one is responsible for secreting a different corticosteroid. Okay, so just to re-clarify this, since there's just a little back and forth with that, the adrenal medulla, okay, which is the inside middle portion of this, is responsible for the sympathetic nervous system, epinephrine, norepinephrine, released in response to that, stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight. The adrenal cortex, on the other hand, is that outside layer, has three different layers. You don't need to know the names of those three layers. Just know that each one of those layers is responsible for a different corticosteroid, which are listed here. So we have three different classifications: mineral corticosteroids, glucocorticoids, and sex steroids. So each of these has a very different job to do. Okay. Aldosterone is the first one there. It acts on the kidneys to promote sodium retention and potassium excretion. So it makes us hold on to sodium and helps us get rid of potassium. So in turn, this causes water retention. As we, in a few more chapters, we're going to talk about different electrolytes. But if you think about wherever sodium goes, water goes, you'll be able to remember this pretty easily. Because if we're promoting sodium retention, we're holding on to sodium, that means we're going to hold on to water as well. Cortisol is the principal glucocorticoid. It helps the body adapt to stress and repair damaged tissues by stimulating the breakdown of fat and proteins. It converts fat and protein to glucose and the release of fatty acids and glucose into the blood. Cortisol has an anti-inflammatory effect. It suppresses the immune system if secreted over a long period of time, and it's really essential for maintaining a normal blood pressure. So it has a lot of different jobs. The sex steroids include a weak form of androgen. This is converted to the more potent androgen, testosterone, and also small amounts of estrogen. The ovaries are also responsible for estrogen production, but after menopause, this adrenal cortex is the thing that's only left to secrete estrogen, which is why a lot of women have the symptoms of menopause, because they have decreased estrogen. Once the ovaries stop producing, we only get a small amount from here. Most testosterone is produced in the testes, though androgens really stimulate pubic and axillary hair and sustain sex drive in both sexes. So you can see that even though some testosterone and estrogen are being secreted from these sex steroids, it's not the primary place where these are being released. Again, there's another chart on page 234. I don't know if I mentioned the one on 232. There's one on 232 for the thyroid and the parathyroid. And then on 234, there's another one for the adrenal glands. So again, these are just really nice places where the information is condensed down for you, and hopefully you can just spend some time making some flashcards from this information and really committing this information to memory. The next gland is the pancreas. Okay, so the pancreas is located in our stomach area. It's located a little bit below the stomach, kind of is long and stretches across the abdomen. The pancreas contains both endocrine and exocrine tissues. The majority of the pancreas acts as an exocrine gland, which we'll talk about when we talk about the GI system. They're these acini glands that secrete digestive enzymes. But what we're going to talk about now is the endocrine function. So interspersed with these acini glands are exocrine glands called pancreatic islets, or the islets of Langerhans. Okay, you can see that here. See the acini and the islets of Langerhans. These little islets contain alpha cells, beta cells, and delta cells. You really need to know what these each do. On page 235, we have different little boxes there at the bottom that are telling you what each one of these do. So the alpha cells secrete the hormone glucagon between meals when blood glucose levels decline. Glucagon stimulates liver cells to convert glycogen into glucose and to convert fatty acids and amino acids into glucose. Because our blood sugar is low, we need more sugar circulating. So it converts glycogen to glucose, thus resulting in increased blood glucose level. The beta cells, on the other hand, secrete the hormone insulin. After eating, the levels of glucose and amino acids in the blood increase. We don't want them to increase too much, though, so the insulin stimulates cells to absorb these nutrients, again, now causing the blood glucose levels to decline. So hopefully you can see that the alpha cells and the beta cells are kind of antagonistic of each other. The delta cells, on the other hand, secrete somatostatin, a hormone that works within the pancreas to regulate the other endocrine cells. It inhibits the release of glucagon, insulin, and growth hormone. So kind of shuts everything off. So a couple of pictures here now that are going to show you the regulation of blood glucose. So this first one here is after eating blood glucose levels rise as glucose flows from the digestive tract into the bloodstream, right? So you eat a meal, anything that has carbohydrate in it is going to be broken down to glucose. So any sort of typical carbs, pastas, breads, things like that, but also fruits and vegetables have carbohydrates in them. Ultimately, it will lead to increased blood glucose in the bloodstream. So the beta cells of the pancreas will secrete insulin. Insulin triggers two reactions. It stimulates the cells to take up more glucose, and it causes the liver to take up glucose and store it as glycogen. The combined result is the glucose levels return to normal, right? So that's what we want to happen. That's a very normal reaction. The other side of that is in between meals, if people wait too long, in between meals, the blood glucose levels can drop, and that's kind of normal. The alpha cells of the pancreas then react by secreting glucagon into the blood. Glucagon stimulates the liver to break down stored glycogen into glucose, which it then releases into the bloodstream, thus causing blood glucose levels to rise. When there's going to be an abnormality of this is going to be what we call diabetes. So you don't need to know all of these pages in your book about diabetes, okay? You just need to know the norms now, which is the normal regulation of blood glucose. So let's watch a little video on that.
Two of the major pancreatic hormones, insulin and glucagon, have opposite effects on levels of blood glucose. It is the actions of both of these hormones that help maintain blood glucose levels within a normal range. After eating, as glucose flows from the digestive tract into the bloodstream, blood glucose levels increase. High glucose levels stimulate the beta cells of the pancreas to secrete insulin. Insulin stimulates the cells to take up more glucose. At the same time, it causes the liver to take up glucose and store it as glycogen. The combined result is that glucose levels return to normal levels. When blood glucose levels decline below a certain point, such as after skipping a meal, the alpha cells of the pancreas release glucagon into the blood. Glucagon stimulates the liver to break down stored glycogen into glucose, which it then releases into the bloodstream. This causes blood glucose levels to increase.
So again, just another recap of what I just mentioned in these pictures here. One last piece here I want to talk about where there's actual glands that secrete things are gonads. So we have ovaries and testes. They're the primary sex organs in males and females, and they're what's really responsible for most of the secretion of estrogen and most of the secretion of testosterone, okay? So we have the cells of the ovarian follicle, which secrete estrogen, okay? Estrogen helps promote the development of female characteristics and also contributes to the development of the reproductive system. It's also a very big part of the menstrual cycle and actual ovulation, which means releasing of the egg. After ovulation, there's a little tissue left behind on the ovary. This is actually responsible for secreting progesterone, and progesterone in combination with estrogen helps to maintain the uterine lining during pregnancy and helps to keep that baby or that embryo kind of tucked in there nice until it's ready for delivery. On the other hand, in the testes, we have secretion of testosterone. Testosterone triggers the development of the male sexual characteristics and also sustains sperm production. So both are responsible for egg and sperm production, which we can't have a functioning reproductive system without. The other thing that I want to draw your attention to quickly is on the page 239 at the bottom. It talks about other endocrine cells and chemicals. So I want you to read that little section and just take note of it, that we talked about all these kind of well-defined glands and what's secreted from them. And that is the majority of the endocrine system. But there are other places where hormones are secreted. So just take a minute to read through that and understand the material that's there.